Hi, welcome back to the TT Wine Explorer podcast. I'm Tania Tomaszewska. It's been a while since we connected here in podcast land. I took a break from podcast planning and recording during recent Canadian summer months, but I'm back on deck and looking forward to bringing more discussions your way. Thanks so much to everyone out there who's been in touch with me and asked when my next episode is being dropped. Here you are. Now, in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere wine world, this time of year, September and October, means picking grapes so that you can crush them and make wine. But the largest wine-producing regions here in British Columbia, the Okanagan and Similkameen valleys, have a very different vintage this year in 2024. It looks really different for many producers. That's because, in comparative terms, there are very few grapes to harvest here this year. Now, there are various factors at play which have led to this, but the main reason is the extreme cold weather that was experienced here in January of 2024. In some parts of our wine-growing regions, it was minus 28 degrees centigrade for 3 or consecutive more days. So this had the effect of extreme damage to vines and the resulting crop for this year. Much of it was lost. There have been some grapes which have grown and are picked, but the yields are very small. So this has been a heartbreaking vintage for many producers in the interior of our province. And earlier in the year, it was estimated that the aggregate financial loss to the sector was in excess of $300 million. So there's a lot of business and hearts that have been affected by this year. So as a result of these challenging times, many local BC producers have elected to import grapes from outside of their region so that they can make wine this year and to keep their businesses going. Since February, if not before, there has been a lot of discussion with the BC wine industry as to how to navigate this devastating growing year, which came off the back of 2 to 3 successive challenging years in our industry. I've observed many points of view within the BC wine industry as to how winemakers and producers should respond, not only to manage these immediate times, but also how to work forward towards renewal and long-term sustainability of the industry in British Columbia. In light of extreme weather events and weather swings, climate change, numerous economic pressures, the cumbersome myriad of our local rules and regulations placed on our business, and other macro aspects facing the global wine industry generally. I think that I could probably do a 10-part series on just some of these topics alone. But for today, I'd like to focus on the current and real-time story around BC wineries which have decided to import grapes or juice this year and are doing that right now. Wineries such as these have chosen to bring grapes in from places like Washington State, Oregon, California, or Ontario, and they're using these inputs to make wine, which will start hitting shelves next year for whites and rosés, and a few years from now, reds. Now, not all wineries are doing this, and each winery will have formed their own view depending on their business plan and their business situation ethos as to whether or not to do this. My guest today is Alison Moyes, the winemaker and general manager of Solvero Wines. Solvero is a very small family winery located in a beautiful small wine subregion called Garnet Valley in Summerland in British Columbia's Okanagan Valley. Solvero is a relative newcomer to the BC wine scene. A very niche player, Solvero is a small producer of premium wines. And is one of the wineries which has chosen this year to bring grapes in from outside. In their case, Oregon. I first met Alison when she was the winemaker at Liquidity Wines in Okanagan Falls. For longtime listeners, you will recall that Ian Macdonald, founder of Liquidity Wine, was my guest in episode 7 of this podcast series. Ian and I discussed liquidity as a case study for building a brand. And as you'll recall, he mentions Alison and her role as part of the team of excellence, focus, and quality. Alison is an excellent winemaker and a phenomenal person to taste with, to learn from, and to discuss world wine matters. I love her style of presenting wines to consumers and to wine explorers alike. She's down to earth, extremely informed, and fun. You'll hear more about Alison's path in a moment. I am delighted to have Alison on as a guest today. I really appreciate and admire all of her thoughtfulness, energy, skill, professionalism, and collegiality, which she brings to absolutely everything she does. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Alison Moyes today. Let's fly. Hi, Alison. Thanks so much for joining as my guest today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we'll dive into our discussion in a moment about what this year looks like for Solvero and your wine region more broadly. But for those listeners out there who don't know you, can you share a bit of your story? How this wine adventure started for you. How did you catch the bug? How did you learn to make wine?
Yeah, it's been a long road, but I suppose I caught the bug, so to speak, in the early aughts. I was out in Halifax. I'd moved there from where I grew up in Ontario to go to university. So I was studying microbiology at Dalhousie University, and wasn't into wine at that point, but ended up working at a restaurant through the latter part of that degree. A fine dining restaurant with an excellent wine list. The owner was a sommelier, and that was my first real opportunity to taste wines in a real way, side by side, to be able to really take in the nuances and the artistry that it encompasses. And so ended up becoming a sommelier, worked in that capacity for a couple of years. And what better combination to put together science and art to go back to school and take an enology degree with the hopes of becoming a winemaker. So went back to school in 2006, graduated from Brock University with an enology degree in 2009, and then pretty quickly moved out to BC. I thought I would make wine in Ontario, but when I came out here in '08 for my first vintage, I knew that this was going to be the place I wanted to make wine for the rest of my career.
I love the background, and we'll get back to it in terms of the art and the science. My experience of wine is that those are such important components and a lot more. So thank you in terms of sharing kind of the back of house experience you have and the front of house, because I think that's really important from a winemaking and consumer perspective. So you mentioned you came to BC. So you had a few cool stops along the way. I mentioned Liquidity. So you focused on learning about diving into the BC terroir, worked with some very different grapes along the way. And now you're at Solvero. So could you share a little bit, provide a snapshot of Solvero in terms of, for people who have not been or are not aware of your winery, the location in Garnet Valley, the general conditions, what you grow there. And I guess what also about the project attracted you to that place?
Yeah. Well, most of my winemaking career has been focused around Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So as a starting point, that was a big draw to this project. I'd followed what Matt and his family were doing since they purchased the property in 2014. And it was a very ambitious viticulture project revolving around Pinot Noir specifically. Most people have not heard of Garnet Valley. And that is because we, along with our neighboring winery, Garnet Valley Ranch, are basically forging a whole new wine region out here in Summerland. If you can picture very steep slopes, almost surface bedrock, it's sort of heterogeneous glacial soils, very challenging to farm. We expect it to be low yielding vineyards for the duration of our farming here, but the quality potential is exceptional. We're also at a very high elevation, so over 600 meters, some of the highest elevation vineyards in BC. And we think that that's going to be the reason why we have the potential for growing Pinot Noir long term.
So having been to the Solvero site a number of times now, I can attest to the uniqueness of its pocket in our wine country. And one of the things I love about it is that for me, my experience is it's surrounded by quite pastoral farmland that isn't all, you mentioned your neighboring wine colleagues, but there are other farming activities going on there, and it's a beautiful bucolic place to drive through. And I guess this leads into my next question, which is your new winery facility and tasting room. It seems to me beautifully positioned for people to take in that bit of that almost juxtaposition of feeling that you're really away from things. So can you describe a little bit about, if people come to visit you, what they can expect to see in terms of the types of wine equipment you have, or the tasting room, or the experiences that you offer?
Absolutely. I love that you pointed out that it is a very unique pocket. I'll just start with that to begin. It is a beautiful meandering drive through a completely different ecology than the main Okanagan Valley. So a short 7-minute sort of drive off of the highway through ponderosa pines, horse ranches. There's lavender farms, mushroom farms, vegetable farms. It's quite a beautiful drive to our location. And then once you arrive, you'll be surprised to find a large state-of-the-art, very modern winery facility dropped essentially into the natural landscape. And that was the vision that we had for that we disturbed as little of the natural landscape as possible, and created this vineyard and winery and tasting room. So what you can expect for a tasting experience is a very relaxed, serene environment with a beautiful vista of the rolling hills and forests of Garnet Valley. We offer a seated portfolio tasting in varietal specific glassware of our very focused portfolio. And often it's Matt, myself, our assistant winemaker, or other members of our production team that are hosting guests when they come to visit us. From a winemaking perspective, our facility and equipment, it's a dream for me. It's very traditional equipment. We don't have anything, no optical sorters or any of the really modern new equipment. But I have all of the key components for quality winemaking, which is temperature control. I have great temperature control on my tanks, which are easy to sanitize. We have a great barrel program. And lots of space to grow into larger production, which is the plan.
And we'll get to, some of the more challenging aspects of winemaking in the context of this vintage in terms of finding grapes. So, there's farming and terroir, and there's art and science, which you talked about, and intuition. But from your perspective, and for people out there who aren't familiar with winemaking or haven't had the opportunity to come to be at a winery at certain critical junctures of the journey of grape to glass, can you give what are some of the critical decisions or times from a winemaker that you're faced during the process to make that wine that you would love a consumer to experience in the glass?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it begins with pruning every year. And in the winter, we're making decisions on how and when to prune the vines, which we'll get to the cold event that we had in January of last year. But that was a pretty big point of decision to make for this year. Throughout the growing season, we're making decisions like how much crop to keep. Do we need to drop some crop on the ground in order to be able to ripen what's left? Do we need to strip the leaves to expose more sunlight on the grapes, or do we want to keep them protected? So all of those farming decisions are hugely important, of course. And then coming into the winemaking, where it begins, my role essentially begins is the call to harvest. That to me is the most important decision. Being present in the vineyard, not just looking at the chemistry and the sugars and the acid of the grapes, but tasting. And determining if the flavors are right, if the complexity is there, and then making that call and getting the grapes picked at the right time. If you get that right, everything else is far, far easier from that point on. I am a low intervention winemaker. I think one of the biggest parts of my role is to know when not to intervene, to let things progress naturally. And just make sure it has all the parameters to be healthy. I mentioned temperature. Often grapes need nutrition during the fermentation, which is typically in the form of nitrogen and other micronutrients. And then guiding that fermentation through to completion, getting wine stabilized. And then the other key component for me is, and this is where the artistry comes in, is the blending. Mm-hmm. Even within one grape variety, I'm just working with Pinot Noir, but within that one variety, we have, for example, 7 different clones, or for lack of a better word, subspecies of Pinot, that I keep all separate, different fermentations, different barrels. So even though it's all Pinot Noir, I might have 50 different components to work with within that one grape.
I would love one day to do a separate episode on clones. I guess that's really for Corked Works, but it's a fascinating discussion. And the more, it's one of those things like in the wine, once you learn, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And the more you learn about clones and blending, it's wild. So this is really a lot about grape growing today and wine. You can't make great wine without great farming and great grapes. So back to that, for lack of a better word, from a business point, input to your winemaking, the grapes. You need grapes to make wine. Solvero this year has decided to import grapes to make your wine for 2024 vintage. There are a lot of layers to this discussion broadly, and I thought we could maybe break it down into a few components, particularly for people who maybe aren't in the industry and aren't aware of all of the background or what's going on now. So the first component would be, I suppose, what has brought you and the business, your business, to the decision or necessity to take this choice to import grapes. What was it in Garnet Valley like this year, or for the local growers that you would source from? What happened in your pocket?
Yeah, well, we were similar to pretty much everywhere else in the Okanagan. I think our low temperature was minus 26 degrees centigrade. So we lost our crop. Essentially, long story short, we have no grapes for 2024. The good news story is that the vines are alive. And it speaks to the resiliency of vines in general, that they were able to tolerate those kind of low temperatures. And we still have the vascular structure it still has integrity. We'll be able to renew for next year. And what that means for us is we have no growth in what we call the canopy, or on what is typically the trellis wire. But we do have suckers growing up from the base. And we've protected a few of these suckers so that we can, quote, retrunk the vine. So that means we cut off the existing trunk, and one of the new suckers will become the trunk for 2025. It remains to be seen what our crop would look like next year, but we're hoping for something around 50% production. So,
yeah. So thank you for I haven't mentioned that part yet. Thank you for talking about vine and vine health, because everyone, or each winery or where they grow, or perhaps what variety they have, or their individual circumstances will vary depending on how their vines and the roots were affected. And so from what I understand, there still will need to be some assessments on a case-to-case basis, and people are going to find out. Maybe some people know how their vines are doing, some don't. So this uncertainty for people, and also how you plan out from 1 to 5 years out, is very much a live issue. And for people who aren't aware, for example, if one needs to pull out vines and replant and to make red wines, typically people would plan on needing at least 4 to 5 years before you're up in full production again. So that's a long time. So thank you but not everyone is going to be in that position. So that's why at the outset mentioned each winery will have its own position in terms of what they're growing, but also how much inventory they have already and how much they can see through their inventory. And that comes into size of winery and scale and maturity. So I'm just mentioning this really more for the listeners. So thank you for raising that about the vines and for this year and what it looks like for you. So you made the decision that for this year, obviously, because, that you would go out. So, where have you gone in broad terms? Where are you finding your grapes, and what was the process like deciding on and how to find them, and the ones that were right for you and the kind of wines that you and Solvero wish to make?
That's right. So we didn't decide to import grapes or juice for all of our different wines. We picked specific SKUs that, we may have been short in inventory for. Particularly Chardonnay for us is a key SKU that we basically have. We're basically sold out at this point. So it's vital to our business to have that on offer for our portfolio. But the strategy was not just to bring anything in from anywhere at the cheapest price possible. We're very strategic in the location we sourced Chardonnay from. And I took a trip down to Washington and Oregon in late June to speak with, I think, about 15 or so different producers at different vineyards throughout both states. And I fell in love with a couple of vineyard sites that were controlled by one producer down there, one in the McMinnville AVA in Oregon. So for base wine sparkling, some Pinot Noir from there, 50-year-old vines on this really cool
Wow.
vineyard site. And then sourced a little bit more Pinot Noir for rosé and some Chardonnay from another amazing property called Abershire in the Chehalem Mountains AVA. And the producer was so collaborative. I really wanted to work with this specific group because they could accommodate small batch premium production. The crop yields were just right. They weren't overcropping. And they could offer a bespoke winemaking setup directed by myself. So every step of the way, I was there making the decision about how to pick, how to press, what to add, how to rack, and all of those steps that I would normally take at the winery here.
It sounds like you've so far had a good experience on that in that front in terms of sourcing grapes that you think fit your program and the ethos of Solvero. So there's so much going on, on the logistics front, and maybe we'll get to the paperwork in a minute, but not get too much into it because there's the winemaking and finding the grapes. And then we're in a time when this is a very unique vintage and there have had to be relaxation of rules and regulations that affect what we call land-based wineries, such as Solvero, which make wine made from grapes from their region. And part of this, maybe we can go into a little bit as an intermediate step, which is what this means for the consumer. So again, I've heard lots of different viewpoints on this from wineries and from consumers. But, one thing I do know and I do see consistency on is the concept of and the theme of truth in labeling, which is if we're dealing with wines that have been made by a BC business and BC winemakers in British Columbia and using some inputs that come from somewhere else, how is that story going to be explained to the consumer? And I guess starting from first steps, the label, what will these look like? So I've spoken to a few wineries and they've said, well, that are bringing grapes in and next year, so let's say some of their whites and rosés will be hitting the shelves from this vintage, and these are my words, of Hard Knocks. They're saying, well, we're going to have completely different branding, different labeling, a new different name so that it's quite clear that the wine that we're making with these grapes came from this vintage and so that we can tell the story and it's distinct. So this might be early days for Solvero and what you're planning to do. And I know that there are rules of what will go on labels, depending where you got your grapes from. But in broad terms, is there anything you can share right now in terms of how the approach will be? Or is that still something you're kind of working through?
Well, obviously it is still early days, but as soon as we decided to do this, that was the first discussion point on what are the labels going to look like and how are we going to communicate this to our loyal customers. And transparency obviously is key. While I was down in Oregon, I took a lot of video and photographs that were working to put towards a marketing video so we could post on our website and share the story of what this vintage looked like for us and how we were still a crucial part of all of the decision making, even though we were harvesting grapes and pressing to juice in Oregon. I will just mention that we did bring juice in. It was unfermented. It's in tank right now and barrel fermenting at the winery. But we decided to bring juice in as opposed to grapes because it is a more stable product at that point and less risk of spoilage. So that was our decision for that. And then the labels, we don't want to completely change our label. We want it to still be distinctive as a Solvero product. But we're looking at a complete color shift. So for those who don't know or never seen our labels, it's sort of like a cream colored background with black logo and text. And so the concept will be to reverse that so that the background is black and the logo and writing is white. And then we include all of the details on vineyard location, the grapes, and exactly where they come from. It remains to be seen whether we can actually put the AVA, or what they call American Viticultural Area. That's more regulated, but we would ideally like to be able to put that on the label, because that's we picked those specific grapes from those specific AVAs for a reason.
So, we've talked a lot about the challenges that have led to wineries' decisions to import grapes, and also, the red tape and all of the extra business aspects that you have to keep in mind in order to make this happen, and truth in labeling and making sure that the consumer knows what they're getting. And just back to my point about consumers being open to experiencing wine and the wine travel, for lack of better words, that can come from this. It seems to me, and maybe, people might not first think of this, that this is also, from a winemaker perspective, a great opportunity and adventure that maybe you wouldn't have chosen for it to unfold this way, to work with the kind of grape varieties that you love to work with in a vintage that you ordinarily wouldn't have the ability to do that, either because of licensing, because you can't use, for these kind of categories of wineries we're talking about. Or I know wineries who are making wine by importing grapes this year of varieties that they normally wouldn't use, because we can get our hands on some fantastic Chenin Blanc from 40-year-old vines. Why not? We're going to make this wine. It's going to be from our business. We have an opportunity to do something different. So let's make lemonade from the lemons. So, how do you feel in terms of your experience of this process and what you as a winemaker are able to do, and what's open to you, and then what you can convey? How do you feel about this?
No, I love that. So for me, that's the biggest positive takeaway from this whole experience, is the chance to go to another really cool growing region that I've always admired and wanted to discover, and to be able to make premium wine that tells us an authentic story of site and season, the same way we would do in BC, but from really cool vineyards in growing regions in Oregon. I spent probably the equivalent of about a month down there, from the time we were deciding on what vineyards to work with, and then with the harvest going down for the call to pick, and throughout the pressing process, working with really passionate, collaborative colleagues and learning from their growers and their winemakers, to be able to produce something that's really exceptional. And in our case, I am working with the same grape varieties. So, for example, our Chardonnay, it happens to be from the Chehalem Mountains AVA, but it's the same clones, so clones 95 and 76 that we grow here on our own property. So same winemaker, same clones from two very different terroirs. And I think that's going to tell a really interesting story for our brand.
And I think that's exciting for everyone, for people who have some favorite wineries in BC and favorite, our fanboys or fangirls of winemakers, and want to try anything that they make. I think this is a great experience for them too, to say, hey, you know what, this year we got these grapes from the special pocket that we've seen, we've gone, try it. What do you think? Here's the story. And for people who love Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, as examples, we try them from all over the world because we're in love with these grapes, and we love the fact that they express themselves differently depending on the terroir or who's making them in the hand. And for me, this is part of the bug, getting back to the very beginning of wine. I mean, I think ultimately it's about connectivity and people clinking glasses and hearing the story and feeling the story of how that wine got in the glass. But I think it's curiosity. I think it's learning. I think it's adventure, and it's wanting to try more. And you will never have a glass of wine that will replicate or duplicate itself from vintage to vintage, from wherever it is, and in terms of what, in broad terms. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very important part of this story of this vintage, which is the adventure and curiosity, and the passion. And those are really important parts driving our industry more broadly. And if we're going to keep going, I think that it's important to keep those keep that going. So thank you so much. I appreciate your insight. You're working hard to keep moving forward and to keep making wine and to keep things going, get wine to the people. You have to deal with cross-border aspects, I assume. So, red tape is an understatement. And I imagine you have to spend hours of your less than few hours left in your day to traverse and navigate all of this. So again, more just from altitude, if you wouldn't mind sharing the types of things that you have to deal with in terms of paperwork, so the kind of everyday consumer knows, what sorts of things, do you have to deal with to have made this happen or being able to do this year anyway?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest pieces that was a challenge, I think, for everyone in the industry was the uncertainty of what these regulations would be. And we were making a lot of decisions before knowing what those changes were. So that was the first kind of difficult thing. We just had to move forward with what we needed to do as a business and hope that those regulations would come through to provide the relief that was promised. As a new business, we are in a bit of a different situation than many others, that our growth trajectory was obviously very different than an existing business that's been around for 30 years. So the relief that's provided may not look the same for us as it does for others, and we're still navigating that. And then on top of that, getting the grapes across the border, as you mentioned, it's something that we've never done before. And there's all sorts of layers to it, including CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the customs piece. There was a ministerial exemption that was required to prove that you have a loss of crop to legitimize bringing the fruit in. And then even just the logistical part of it, the trucking. So how do you get grapes or juice from its location in Washington or Oregon safely and without spoilage in good condition to the winery here?
So how long has that taken generally? Can you give a few anecdotal examples of that so people get a sense?
Yeah. So
for the shipping or transporting, for example.
Right. So we worked with a specific trucking company called Container World, who put together essentially a fleet of trucks in response to this crisis. And they are reefer trucks. So that was a critical point, meaning refrigerated trucks so that we could keep the product cold. But there are also 53-foot trailers, which are expensive. And being such a small producer and trying to harvest the grapes at the right time, we aren't filling up a truck. We have, 4 totes of something that we then have to work with other wineries in our area that are doing the same thing to try and consolidate those shipments. And so you can imagine the logistics of getting all of that product on a truck at the right time, everyone with their correct paperwork, so that there's no delay at the border. Because you can imagine if somebody has an error in their paperwork and they flag that and it gets stuck for 2 or 3 days, that can potentially compromise the quality of everything on that truck. It's a very time-sensitive type of situation.
So huge relief when you see that truck driving along the road towards your winery.
Honestly, I haven't slept. I
shouldn't laugh. I'm sorry, but just standing, looking, waiting for the truck. Oh.
Last night was my first really, really good night's sleep. We got our last, the Chardonnay arrived, and I unloaded it at about noon yesterday. We got it into barrel, and it's looking great. It arrived in great shape. The winery did a great job. I was there for them racking it to tank, and they chilled it down to about 2 degrees, loaded it, so put it into totes to ship onto a 2-degree Celsius truck same day. And then it took about 24 hours to get here, and I unloaded it. And yeah, it's in great shape. I'm very happy.
I thought just to finish up the conversation, we might take things up back from altitude to have a general discussion, whether it's in the context of Solvero or, observations more broadly about what we're seeing and hearing in our industry, with discussions with our colleagues, whatever facet they are sitting in the industry, or observers. And we've talked a little bit about the unknowns for next year, or the knowns. You said, you're hopeful about what the vines might be able to produce. Some people don't know exactly what the next 5 years will look like from a production point of view. But in addition to that, in terms of going forward, disruption and challenge and adversity, whether it's in business or in life, we often say that these things can bring change and renewal. And so there's been talk about what we think the BC wine industry could or should look like in 2030 and beyond, and this could be a turning point for whether we're industry participants or consumers in terms of going forward towards sustainability in the broader term. And I think this is a really important topic because in addition to wine, this gets back to the tourism. So much about, I feel, the experience of wine is being in the place. And, we're in supernatural British Columbia, and being able to go out to the wine region and, if wineries don't have enough stock or don't have enough grapes to make wine, what will the people have? So, and what are we, and, there's lots of offshoots of wine exploring. So I guess, with that in mind, in broad terms, what types of things are you hearing? Again, maybe this is for people who are not in the industry itself. I'm hearing about things like, well, if we're pulling up vines, what should we be replanting? Are the grape varieties that we're using in certain places, is that a good way to go forward? Because, Mother Nature, we are continuing to be on a roller coaster. Should we have less is more? What do you think are some takeaway headline issues for the go forward, looking forward to a 2030 or 2035 plan for the industry that are right now at front of mind? Or is it, let's just get through this vintage? And I completely would understand that.
Well, I mean, right now, I think it is a little bit of that because we're in harvest right now. I think everybody is very much focused on just getting through and making sure that we get everything in that we're working to get in. There's a lot of uncertainty. I can't claim to know what it's going to look like 2030 and beyond. But I do have some thoughts. I remain cautiously optimistic about the future of our industry. I think the positive way to look at what's happened this year is that it is an opportunity for a reset of sorts. I mentioned that we aren't going to be replanting our vines. Our younger vines did reasonably well. And actually, intuitively, you would think that older vines would fare better in these conditions, when in fact, it seems across the board, younger vines have been more resilient. But for those that are replanting, it's likely that there should have been a successive replant plan in place regardless, and now it's sort of been forced to happen all at once. And we can make strategic decisions on what to plant in those locations, not necessarily French American hybrids, but switching to something like Riesling or vines that are more tolerant in those specific locations. Looking at it from another angle, I think we need to build more diversification and resiliency into our business plans in general. If we can expect weather events to occur more often, I think we need to plan for that in our businesses, which I don't think had been done to a large extent. And then there's other protective things, we're looking at everything from geotextile fabric to using high pressure air in the drip lines to protect for cold temperatures. Some of these they're not entirely practical with the resources that we have, but I think there'll be a lot of research and investment in research and developing ways to protect our vines.
Thank you so much for those points. Some of those I don't hear a lot of recently, and I think for the reasons you mentioned, which is we're just all trying to get through 2024. The business plan one is an excellent one. And I think from altitude, again, looking back at times like from the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm talking about most businesses, not in the wine industry, a lot of people did not have that as a part of their business plan in terms of what to do for provisioning. I mean, who would have? But, in terms of the one certain thing is that there will continue to be uncertainty, I think, in the broad sense with swings in weather. And like I said, we have huge diversity in our wine region. Some are in desert and some are in cooler climate. So we have a patchwork. I personally think the diversity is wonderful. I love the fact that we have the diversity. So, it's not an easy question to answer because people will be looking at their production facilities and the grapes that they're making and what's going to work on their land. What equipment do you need? Your viticulture practices, how you look at farming, everything. So it's a lot, and there are multiple layers. So thank you for mentioning some of those. I really tempted to ask Pinot Noir. I mean, I know you love that grape, and you've said, where you go, you want to make Pinot Noir. And, in the Wine Islands region on the coast of British Columbia, Pinot Noir has seen increasing success, I think, for a couple of things, which is, again, change in weather patterns and growing season patterns, and also investment in viticulture and resources and understanding and wanting to plant that grape. And because sparkling wine does very well on the coast, what do you think for Okanagan Valley? Again, it's hard. We don't have the crystal ball, but what are your hopes? It's a heartbreak grape, but yet it does work well in what we call marginal areas in the world. So I guess that's part of your continued optimism?
Well, yes, I certainly want to continue making Pinot Noir in the Okanagan Valley. It may not be as widespread as it was before. With climate change, it can be expected that as certain vineyard sites warm up, it may not be as conducive to that grape variety. But I have... I know that Pinot Noir will be a part of the landscape long term in the Okanagan. I mean, specifically on a site like ours, it's just perfect for Pinot Noir. One aspect of the site that we're on that I didn't mention is Garnet Valley, which runs parallel to the main Okanagan, is a little bit narrower between those mountains. So we get a little less sunlight a day, about 15 minutes per day, but the same number of heat units. So we don't get really that extreme exposure at the hottest part of the day on the grapes. And at our high elevation, this is the perfect grape to grow in our specific site. And I think everywhere Okanagan falls north, there are some great vineyard locations for growing really premium Pinot Noir. We also have the desert climate, which really helps with growing something like Pinot, which is quite thin-skinned and can be susceptible to mildew. So when you have high humidity environments, that can be a bit more of a challenge. So
I can't wait to come and try your Pinot Noir and your other wines and come back to Solvero in 2025, because we're almost at the end of 2024. So I would like to thank you now so much for coming on as my guest, particularly given that last night was your first night having sleep in a long time. So I really, really appreciate it. And to sharing your insights and the story of what you and the winery that you're with are going through right now. I think it's a very important story to tell. And I'm wishing you and Solvero all the best for the balance of this season. And as you hit the cellar and the barrel room over the winter months. And I look forward to seeing you in early 2025 for a visit. So thank you so much. And I hope that you can get some rest today and tonight.
Thanks so much, Tania. It's been really fun chatting.
Hey, thanks for tuning into my show with Alison Moyes today. I hope that you enjoyed our discussion. For those not working in the wine industry, I hope that my chat with Alison helped to shed a bit more light for you around some of the challenges being faced right now by our local wine producers here in British Columbia. I also think, though, that it shows and exemplifies the passion and determination which drives artisanal small winery business, not only in British Columbia, but globally. And it is this universal power of wine and passion which I think drives the wine industry wherever you go, together with the curiosity of winemakers, founders of new wine businesses, and everyday tasters and consumers like you and me. If you have any questions for Alison or would like to learn more about the Solvero Wine Project, please do let me know and I can connect you. You can reach me at Tania@ttwinecouncil.com, on Instagram at ttwineexplorer, or find me on LinkedIn and message me there. Or you can go to Solvero's website and sign up to receive their newsletters or follow them in the Instagram world. If you have any friends, family, or colleagues who are interested in any of the topics which Alice and I discussed today, please do share this podcast episode or series with them. As you know, ratings and comments on platforms like Apple Podcast and Spotify help small podcasters like me expand and grow our listening group. So if you're up to helping me out with that, I'd love it. But most importantly, keep exploring and tasting. I look forward to seeing you back here again soon on the TT Wine Explorer podcast. Take care.